Hello, my name is John Franke. I am the theologian in residence at Second Presbyterian Church, and we are here today for study number 3 in our series this fall, Isaiah's Light in the Darkness, Hope When Faith Feels Heavy. And today we'll be looking at two sections from Isaiah, one in chapter 24 and one in chapter 25, and these actually offer a pretty remarkable contrast in terms of their focal points. But before I do that, before we look at 24 and 25, I just want to do a quick sketch of where Isaiah is up to this point. The context for this text is the divided monarchy. Israel is divided into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is referred to as Judah and the northern as Israel. So if you've ever wondered why you get these two different names, Judah and Israel, that's the reason. And then another context is the challenges from imperial powers. You've got the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and later the Persian Empire, all who threaten Israel in one way, and Judah in one way or another. So Isaiah is deeply embedded in the realities, the political and social realities of the context in which this document is written and put together. But what's interesting is that while it's very serious about those things, it's not primarily about politics, but it's rather about the faithfulness of Yahweh in the midst of the political situation, because it's Yahweh who is seen as the primary player in the life of Judah and in the world around Judah. Walter Brueggemann, the well-known Old Testament scholar, says this of the book of Isaiah, quote, "The book of Isaiah, with wondrous artistry, manages to hold together the realities of lived political history in that ancient world and the inscrutable reality of Yahweh, who is said here to impinge decisively in that history," unquote. And it's that context that I'd like us to be thinking about as well in the midst of the world around us and all that is going on, rooting our faith in the God revealed in the Hebrew prophets and in Jesus Christ, who gives us hope and calls us to action. From the perspective of Isaiah, Yahweh or God is pictured as endlessly surprising, mysterious, and elusive. It's hard to pin this God down. We aren't always able to predict what God will do. And there are sections throughout Isaiah, we're going to see two of them in our study today, that are unbearably harsh as well as joyous and healing. There are three concentric circles. If you think about this section of material up through chapter 25, verses 1 through 12, or chapters 1 through 12, focus on Yahweh's judgment and promise concerning particularly Judah, the southern kingdom, and Jerusalem. So the focal point is on Judah and Jerusalem. In a next section, 13 through 23, the focus is on Yahweh's judgment and promise concerning the nations, the larger world. And then in 24 and 25, the chapters that we're looking at, that expands a bit further to Yahweh's judgment on the power of evil in the world and the hope of new life for the faithful remnant of the Hebrew people. And so it's in that context that we look at the sections we're taking a look at from chapters 24 and 25. In chapter 24, we were studying particularly verses 17 through 20. It'd be great if you had the text in front of you. I'll read this here, starting in 17. It's a challenging text. "Terror and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. Whoever flees at the sound of the terror shall fall into the pit, and whoever climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. For the windows of heaven are open and the foundations of the earth tremble. The earth is utterly broken. The earth is torn asunder. The earth is violently shaken. The earth staggers like a drunkard. It sways like a hut. Its transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls and will not rise again. This is harsh and strong language. It's probably not the kind of language that we typically look for in the Bible. And if we're aware of it, it's probably not where we like to spend our time. These three terms right at the beginning of verse 17, terror, pit, and snare, form a literary triad or a device. And in Hebrew, all of these words begin with the same letter and articulate the idea that no one can escape the coming trouble. The calamity that is befalling the earth is endemic and will ensnare everyone, and even those who try to escape will find themselves trapped. The wonders of heaven, or the windows of heaven, are spoken of as openings through which the waters of chaos are released and the earth is inundated and shattered. This is an allusion back to the flood narrative in Genesis. And then we get this fourfold repetition of earth, utterly broken, torn asunder, violently shaken, staggering like a drunkard, is a rhetorical device depicting the earth as a dead creation that is going to fall and will not rise. So this is hard language. It sets up the context for chapter 25 and reminds us that biblical faith is not naive. It is not Pollyannish. It is aware of the challenges facing the world. And we may feel the same way. We have a very divisive election season. We have unrest throughout the world. And we may wonder what hope there is. And it's worth, I hope, in your discussion groups or as you look at this individually, that you will spend some time taking seriously the challenges facing the world. But rather than lapsing into despair, Isaiah makes a stunning shift in chapter 25, and we're looking at verses 1 through 10. But if chapter 24 is primarily one of nullification and destruction, chapter 25 is primarily one of affirmation and confidence. The chapter begins with a lyrical, celebrative doxology filled with gratitude, thanksgiving, and praise in the midst of the very calamities spoken of in chapter 24. So, O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things, plans formed of old, faithful and sure. So here is this wonderful doxology of faith and confidence in God, speaking of the wonders of God. And yet these wonderful things surprise us, because the first thing we're told is of this city that has been ruined. Right in verse 2, for you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The palace of aliens is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. And then in verse 3, we're told, therefore strong peoples will glorify you, and cities of ruthless nations will fear you. We're surprised here that this wondrous thing is the ruination of a city. Now, we're not told exactly which city this is. Probably readers of Isaiah would have imagined Babylon, or one of the groups that were oppressing Israel, and perhaps it was Babylon. But this city of aliens is a clue that it's all those communities and peoples that would oppress Judah, the empires that are built on wealth and arrogance and autonomous power and exploitation. And commentators on this portion of Isaiah have seen in the way this opens up to the idea of the palace of aliens, is that it's not just a specific city, but it's all of those communities and powers, common word for them is empires, that are built contrary to the will of Yahweh, contrary to the will of God, who seeks goodness for all people. More about that in a minute. These ancient Near Eastern empires or communities are known as domination societies. They're built on the backs of the poor, and they oppress the poor and the needy. Isaiah speaks of these poor and needy who are first of all Jews, but in the power of this passage, it becomes clear that the poor and needy are all who are crushed under the influence of empire, and that it is God who intervenes on behalf of the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed against this empire. As we read on in the text, God has become a refuge to the poor, verse 4, a refuge to the needy in their distress, a shelter from the rainstorm. Remember that we talked about the opening of the heavens, and a shade from the heat when the blast of the ruthless was like a winter rainstorm, the noise of aliens like heat in a dry place. You subdued the heat with shade, the shade of clouds. The song of the ruthless was stilled. On this mountain, we're told that the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples, everyone, not just the Jews, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained and clear. The picture is, in the midst of these calamities, of a restoration, of God who will intervene against the mighty as a refuge for those who have no resources and who are vulnerable. Verses 6 through 10a speak of this radical and complete transformation of the social order, with a positive side, that feast of rich food and well-aged wines for all peoples, and a negative side, the destruction of that which threatens this feast of generosity. Sometimes we, in our context, can often imagine God as being fairly neutral as God looks on the world, not taking sides. But it's clear from the perspective of Isaiah that Yahweh is a God who takes sides, on the side of the poor, the vulnerable, the needy, the helpless, and against the proud, the powerful, the arrogant, and those who would oppress the needy. And God, it's clear, Isaiah says that God intends the nullification of these domination societies, because it's these very societies and the people who make them up and support them and participate in them that are keeping God's vision for a world where everyone has enough and no one needs to be afraid from coming to reality. It's interesting, at the end of this passage in verse 10b, this last section, we're told about the Moabites. We're told that the Moabites shall be trodden down in their place, as straw is trodden down in a dung pit. The reference to the Moabites here picks up the Old Testament usage of Moab as a figure for all of the powers that resist Yahweh and abuse Yahweh's people. This reminds Judah as well that they also have a choice. They are not immune from God's judgment simply because they are God's people. In fact, we know in the prophetic literature that on many occasions God judges God's own people because they start acting like Moab, because they oppress the hopeless and the downtrodden. They must trust in Yahweh and commit themselves to being the people that Yahweh commands them to be if they are to avoid the fate of Moab. So here we get something of the contrast of the righteous and the unrighteous, and the implicit call and invitation in this text not only to hope for the future, but also to actively participate in that future. Because where does one look for in this fulfillment? Would it be easy to read these texts in the midst and thinking about the time in which they were written or in our own day and wonder, where does one look for this great fulfillment? After all, don't we still live in a world filled with oppression, arrogance, hatred, conflict, death, and mourning? Indeed, the last chapters of the New Testament, Revelation 19 through 22, take up these very words in Isaiah, promising a day when God will finally judge the imperial powers, wipe away tears, and invite people to this same great banquet that is envisaged here in Isaiah. And we might be inclined to ask, how will that happen? How is this going to come about? I suggest that in the economy of God, yes, God will do this. God will bring this about. But God has chosen to bring this about by calling a people. So God calls Israel to be a blessing to the nations and challenges Israel and Judah along the way when they're failing and getting off course. God sends Jesus and calls a people to engage in this work, to live into that which God intends, the bringing about of this great banquet, the wiping away of tears, and the establishment of a new community. And God calls for a faithful response in the midst of a very divided world. In Christian terms, we focus on the ministry of Jesus to bring about peace and humanity, or peace and harmony in the world. And there's a specific invitation to the church to be a place of unity, to engage in the ministry of unity, as we've been talking about in our sermon series, built around Christ the center. In Ephesians chapter 2, picking up on this theme in Isaiah of peace in the world amongst all people, we're told that Jesus is the one who brings the two groups together, which from the Jewish perspective of Paul, the author of the letter to the Ephesians, that's everybody in the world. So in verse 14, the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile is broken down. In verse 15, there's one new humanity in the place of two, bringing peace. Both groups in verse 18 are reconciled, putting hostility to death. Verse 19, Jew and Gentile are no longer strangers and aliens. Through Christ and the Spirit, they are members of one family. As we live into this vision of Isaiah and we're confident in God, we also feel a summons to action that God has called a people to be the instruments by which God will bring about this vision. To be sure, we cannot do it without God, but God has chosen not to do it without us. And we share in this work with our Jewish friends. They use the term tikkun olam, the repair of the world, to speak of this idea in Judaism of participating in this divine work to bring about this wonderful vision that we find here in Isaiah 25. In Christian terms, we think about the sheep and the goats, the contrast between the righteous and the unrighteous, and the call to be faithful, to welcome the stranger, welcome the other, and to care for the poor, the needy, and the oppressed. In Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, we see this great vision and the proclamation of Jesus inviting us to action to bring about the world that God intends, as envisioned in Isaiah. So in conclusion, what we see in Isaiah 24 and 25, I'd suggest, are four elements. One, a realistic appraisal of the situation. This is no a Pollyannish, naive view of the realities of the world we live in. We live in difficult times. Second, it is a hopeful vision in the midst of the challenges that we face, that the Judah faced in the time in which Isaiah was writing and that we face today, and the challenges, the times that make us wonder, how can this hope that we have in God be realized? That we take solace and hope that God is at work to bring about the world God intends. There is also a warning here that we cannot imagine that our actions do not have consequence and that it is possible to be on the wrong side of things. And there's a warning here. Don't be like Moab. Don't ignore the cries of the poor and the needy. And finally, there is an implicit call to action, to be part of the community of God's people that bring about this great vision that Isaiah speaks to, a vision of a great banquet that the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples, a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines for all people. May God strengthen us to be the people that God has called us to be as we work toward this end in the midst of challenging times. Amen.